Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sarah and this is my granny era. Today I want to share with you guys a little research project that I engaged in the first part of December. I was participating in the Ghosts of Christmas Past Resurrecting a Tradition reading event that was put on by several of my favorite booktubers. I will put links in the description box. But I joined this reading event for a specific reason. I had some questions. So I have been studying the Victorian era for about 10 years or so, and I've just had a few questions regarding their, I wouldn't say obsession with death, but maybe more comfortability. We look at it now as an obsession because when we look at death in this era, it freaks us out. We try to avoid it, right? We're doing all kinds of different health things and, mental health things and whatever to try to avoid death and, outrun it and maybe even end it altogether. And so we have a different concept about death than they did during the Victorian times. They were much more comfortable with it. It was much more a part of their everyday life. And so we can look at that as, wow, they were so obsessed. But really, I don't really think that was the case. But either way, I have some questions about that, the way that they approached death, and in that, what made them afraid. I wanted to look at some of these ghost stories from Victorian times and from more modern times and try to answer a couple of questions. The first thing was I wanted to know, why did the Victorians tell ghost stories at Christmas? What was it about this time of year that seemed spooky to them? And then secondly, what makes a tale spooky in the first place? Now, being that I have read quite a bit of Victorian literature, both the, established classics, as well as just a bunch of kind of fringy, out there, not so popular, sensational type novels that I have just found around at various bookstores, I felt like I had a pretty good answer already to the reason for these types of tales. But I was curious about why they would choose Christmas time to tell these types of stories, and even more so, what was so spooky about these seemingly tame stories. So I spent about 10 days at the beginning of the month diving into some of these tolerably spooky stories, and I wanted to share the results of my findings with you guys today. My intention was to focus specifically on stories that contain ghosts because that was the direction that the reading event prompt was going. But I did end up reading Hound of the Baskervilles, which I was under the assumption was a ghost story, but turned out not so much to be. But it's okay because it still answered some of my questions about fear. So the 5 stories were these. I have already mentioned Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle. And basically there's just a hound that maybe has been haunting this family for several generations. And there's a horrific story, that is to the point of legend status now because it happened a while back, about one of the members of the Baskervilles family who, was murdered by this demon hound, and then it looks like it could be happening again. And so Sherlock Holmes and Watson are on the case to figure out what is going on here. And it was a fun read. However, I am actually really shocked at how long it took me to read this. This is only like 120 pages. And I spent over a week on it. And I think I was just very distracted. We were also watching Agatha Christie's Poirot on TV at the same time in the evenings. And so I think I was just getting like these British detectives, not necessarily mixed up, but personalities, right? I was thinking more of Poirot when I was reading about Holmes, and it was just it was a whole thing. But anyway, I got through it. I enjoyed it. I'm glad I read it. It wasn't a waste of time. But it also wasn't a ghost story. Okay, and then secondly is one that I've already sent off to someone else, but this is Wait Till Helen Comes by Mary Downing Hahn. This is a story that goes way back to my childhood. I think the first time I read it, I was like in the 4th grade. And this is literally the scariest thing I've ever read in my entire existence. I will talk quite a bit more about that here in a few minutes, but if you were an 80s kid or an early 90s kid or even a late 70s kid, you probably were familiar with this story. I literally have read this story dozens and dozens of times. And anyway, it's just about a young girl who finds a ghost in a graveyard. And like I said, I'll get more into that here in a minute. The next one, these are in no particular order, by the way, but I did read through A Christmas Carol for my yearly tradition. And I have a whole video on this just about Scrooge, basically, that I did last week. I will link that in the description box. And then I'm getting ready to do a sort of an analytical video on A Christmas Carol here in a couple of days. My goal is to have it up before Christmas Day, but we'll see. Anyway, I did read that. And if you're not familiar with the story of A Christmas Carol, you guys go watch that other video that I put out and it will tell you the deep stuff about Scrooge. Next up was I read with the group read for the Ghost of Christmas Past reading event. I did a book or a story from Elizabeth Gaskell, which is called Old Nurse's Story. It's from her Gothic Tales, which I did read through all of these last year at the beginning of the year, and then went back and reread Old Nurse's Story for this specific event. And it's just kind of a story. I'll talk about that one in a minute too. I don't want to give too many details away because I got a whole bunch of stuff written down. And then lastly, I read this book called The Thing at the Foot of the Bed. Now, when I was a kid, this was me and my brother's ghost story book. We didn't have a whole lot of that kind of stuff. My mom didn't usually let us read a whole lot of really scary things. You know, she wasn't aware of all the Stephen King and etc. that I was hiding, or maybe she was, I don't know. But anyway, but we did have this one that I think we stole from our cousin, and it's just a book full of ghost stories. At the time, you know, before I picked this up again, I thought it was a book full of ghost stories. But now I'm going back and looking at it, it's really a book of folklore, and I am planning on keeping this in my you know, my little reference section in my library that is specifically for folklore, because it's got a lot of really great stories from all over the place. But it has different sections, like funny stories, scary stories. I don't know. Anyway, it has a few different sections, and it has illustrations, and it was just as, you know, just as I remembered it when I went back through and read this. I read it for the first time in probably 35 years. I bought it off of eBay. So anyway, those are the books I analyzed. I had 3 from the Victorian times. I had 2 from my own childhood, right? And my plan was I need to see what is scary, you know, for the Victorians compared to what is scary for, you know, innocent, naive me. And so that was kind of what I was comparing there. In each story, I asked myself 3 questions. So the first one was, what role does the ghost play in this story? Is the ghost actually evil? And is the character afraid of the ghost, and why? So those are the questions I was kind of looking at here, and then it helped me answer those bigger questions that I talked about earlier. I was also curious about the motives of the author. Were they trying to scare their audience? And if so, why? And how were they doing that? Were they trying to just prompt shivers down their spine, or was it something a little bit deeper than that? So before I go any further with the Victorians, let's talk about the more modern stories. I've not read anything that actually made me afraid in at least 25 years, except for that book, Wait Till Helen Comes, that I have read a couple of times in adulthood. That one freaked me right out. 2019 is the last time that I was terrified reading that story. It really messed with me. But I don't go after horror fiction here in my more adult years, and that's just not something that I'm interested in reading about. So I can't really speak to the current adult fiction market. It's probably a lot meatier than than Wait Till Helen Comes by Mary Downing Hahn, but still. So I can't really speak to that, and that's why I chose to look more at what scared me back when I was more naive and young. So then I started to wonder, like, what is the thrill of scaring ourselves? Why do we read stuff that we know is going to scare us? And I got to thinking about that. For me, I think it's about addressing the worst case scenarios. If I can think of the scariest, worst, most horrible things that can possibly happen, then whatever happens in real life won't be that bad, right? I mean, could the worst case scenario actually happen? In my case, yeah, it did. And that's, I think, why when I read Wait Till Helen Comes, here in these last couple of weeks, it did not scare me because the scariest things that I can imagine have already happened to me. I'll get into that in a second. But I think another reason why we like to scare ourselves like that is to really actually confront fear in the face. Look at it straight on, bring it into the light and say, is this actually as scary as I thought it was? Like I said, I don't like to read scary things, death, demonic, but I do like to confront fear and look it in the face every now and then. I like to be honest with myself about what I actually should be afraid of. So reading these Victorian ghost stories, it's really hard for me to imagine that these stories actually made them afraid, shaking, terrifying, can't turn off the lights, sort of scary. I think it was a little bit deeper than that. And I think that for a lot of it, it just made them feel uncomfortable, like that weird kind of uncomfortable that you're just kind of cringing and, you don't know what to do with. In A Christmas Carol, a story that is packed full of humor and relatability, the ghosts are bringing Scrooge's flaws out into the light and forcing him to face them. These ghosts don't seem to scare him. Even Marley's ghost doesn't seem to scare him, as much as it makes him think about things that he doesn't want to be thinking about. I think this author, Catherine Krober Wiley, who wrote the introduction to my copy of A Christmas Carol, I really like how she summed this up. She says, "While Christmas celebrations predate Dickens, and there existed before him a tradition of telling ghost tales at Christmas and the turn of the year, Dickens breathed a new and a unique vigor into these celebrations and traditions that carry forward to this day. In his Christmas books, he allowed supernatural elements a power to awaken characters and readers from their social misanthropy." I think it's the opportunity for telling a moral tale that puts these stories at the heart of Christmas. Christian or not, Christmas has traditionally been a time to remember those in need and theoretically to do something about it. Whether or not we do, that's another story. I think there's an element in Dickens' writing that points out religious hypocrisy and apathy from the people who are supposed to be the most compassionate. It's a lot like I said about Nathaniel Hawthorne, but people like Scrooge who can be so hard-hearted and apathetic towards people that they really should be able to give a little to, right? Don't they need to be shaken up a little bit now and then with some of these scary stories? When Marley takes Scrooge to the window to see all of the ghosts that are flying about and they're unable to find rest, he says it's because they have regrets about how they treated others when they were alive. He says, "The misery with them all was, clearly, that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever." And I think that is kind of the warning of some of these Victorian ghost stories. Do as much good as you can, wherever you can, for as long as you can, right? I think that's what they're getting at here. It's not a terrifying, scary in the dark, but it definitely makes you uncomfortable if you're one of those people who can give and just won't. What really scares Scrooge in this story is when he realizes that when he dies, there's nobody who is going to mourn him. He did not matter and he did not leave a positive impact on the world. I think his morals get rattled a little. In Elizabeth Gaskell's Old Nurse's story, we see another kind of moral tale. It is possible that this one has kind of a double layer of fearful events though, and I'm hesitant to give spoilers because so many are reading this for the reading group event and maybe a little behind. I don't want to be the one who gives the story away, but I will say generally that is the story of a household of women who are trying to protect a young girl from a ghost who the young girl has compassion for. It actually kind of did remind me a little bit of Wait Till Helen Comes when I was looking at that part where we had a living girl and a dead girl and possible friendship going on there. But because of the way that this ghost came to be, there's a whole second element to this fearful story that involves the patriarchy and oppressed women that I also think could have been seen as scary, not spooky scary, but that deeper kind of scary that makes one feel uncomfortable. Ultimately, the story ends with a literal reminder that the mistakes we make in our pasts could haunt us forever. If that's not a moral tale, I don't know what one is. And right from the beginning, when I was reading The Thing at the Foot of the Bed, I read several of these that I recognized that moral tale element. Were these supposed to be tongue-in-cheek? Were they kind of a sarcastic response to an oppressive society? Or were they meant to be oppressive themselves? This one story that has really stuck with me from this book, when I had forgotten about all of the others, was the story of the Golden Arm. And it's fairly short, so I'm going to read it to you. It goes like this. The Golden Arm. Once there was a man had a woman for a wife named Elvira, and this woman had a golden arm. She was awful proud of it. It was solid, shining gold from the shoulder clear down to the nail of her little finger. She liked it even better than the real one. Every night when she went to bed, she used to say to her husband, "If I die first, promise to bury me with my golden arm." "Yes, Elvira, I promised," the man would say night after night after night. Well, it happened that the woman got sick and died. The man buried her and her golden arm along with her, just as he had promised. But after a while, he began to think about it. He began to think about what he could do with all that gold. It seemed a shame for it just to lie there in the ground. He began to want the golden arm, and the more he thought about it, the more he wanted it. So one dark night, in the middle of the night, he decided to go get it. He put on his long dark coat, and he lit his lantern, and he went trudging through the cold dark lanes till he came to the graveyard, and he dug up Elvira and took the golden arm. He tucked it under his long coat and started back home. On the way home, it started to rain and hail, snow and blow, but he didn't think of that. He got home all right. And when he got home, he didn't know where to hide the golden arm, so he pushed it under the covers of the bed. Then he jumped into bed himself and shivered and shook. He couldn't get warm because the golden arm was cold as ice. And the wind rose, and he heard a voice wailing, "Where's my golden arm?" The man pulled the covers up over his head so he wouldn't hear it, but he heard it just the same. He heard it coming down the road. It was crying in the road, "Where's my..." And on the porch, "Golden," and at the door, "Arm." And the wind howled over the top of the door, "Where's my golden arm?" The man shivered and shook under the covers, and then he peeked out, and he saw it. It was by the bed, and it pounced. "You've got it!" That's the end of the story, and then there's a footnote here. This is one of the most famous scary stories told. It is said to have been told around every Boy and Girl Scout campfire ever kindled. This is the story Mark Twain used to tell to scare whole audiences, and he explained that it is in the timing of the pause just before the pounce that makes for success or failure in the telling. If you get the pause just right, he said, someone in the audience will surely scream. So here's a moral tale about what happens to a greedy man, right? But this story also brings up the question, what makes a story scary? I mean, yeah, this story is a little weird and creepy, but does it keep me up at night? No. Am I just desensitized? I don't think so. I actually make a pretty good effort, like I said, to stay away from a lot of scary stories, things that just bring me negative thoughts and feelings in general. No, I wonder if part of what scares us about a story is in the telling, the timing, the setting, and the atmosphere, the tone of voice. The first section of The Thing at the Foot of the Bed is set up to tell you that it's supposed to be funny. So you're expecting that from these first few stories because it tells you these are going to be funny stories. The stories are simply told, but you're also expecting to laugh, right? So you're not going to feel that sense of apprehension. But then you get to the Golden Arm story, and the author actually, at the end of it, gives you instructions for how to tell it with the best effect. So while it's not necessarily scary, I could see how told in the right setting with the right person, it might freak him out a little bit. In her biography of Charlotte Bronte, Elizabeth Gaskell tells about a time when she told Charlotte ghost stories and had her pretty freaked out. Charlotte said that she was superstitious, and so she didn't like dwelling on things that would make her afraid. So does a good storyteller play on those fears of that person they're telling the story to? Is that the key to freaking people out? I thought about that a lot when I was reading Wait Till Helen Comes, okay? Because like I said, that is the story that I have read since I was a little girl dozens of times. Basically, in that story, you have a blended family. You have a mother and her two children, a boy and a girl. And then you have a father and his one child, a daughter. Now, I get the impression that the boy and the girl's father, they're just divorced, right? Their dad is off somewhere. But the little girl, her mother actually died in a horrific fire. And so this family comes together, the parents get married, and they decide to move to a renovated church out in the country. It's a old church that has been made into a home, and it has a graveyard in the backyard and then forest all around. And so right near the beginning of the story, the young girl, the one that is her mother passed away, she meets a ghost in the graveyard. And this ghost, her name is Helen. She is trying to take young Heather for her own. She is lonely, she wants a friend, and she is trying to make sure that Heather can be with her for eternity. The stepsister, the daughter of, the new stepmother, she is very in tune with what is going on. The brother, not so much. He's kind of off doing his own hobbies, but the daughter is very in tune. And her name is Molly, and she is trying to expose Heather for, hanging out with this ghost, as well as try to even save her from it. But there is a lot of anger within this blended family. Everybody is just on each other all the time. It's not a super happy family that has come together here. They're still trying to work out the kinks of things that are normal in blended families. So part of, I think, the spookiness for a young kid is a lot of the story is just very negative. There's a lot of negative things that happen that also play on the fears of children. Talks about kids from a blended family. One of them has lost a parent in a horrific way. There's child attitudes, right? This blended family is not cohering very well. They've moved to a new place that kids don't want to be there. They have new school to get to know, new friends and all that kind of stuff. For a kid like me who had a relatively an easy, happy life up to a certain point, these were really scary things for me, right? They factored into the overall mood that story created in me. And in fact, like I said, reading through the story of Helen this time didn't terrify me nearly as much as it has in the past. I even tried to freak myself out. I read most of it when everybody was in bed and most of the house was dark. I was really trying to see what scared me about this book, but this time it didn't scare me. I realized that it wasn't just about the ghost. This story has so many unsettling elements that it just kind of created an atmosphere, right? You're thinking about being misunderstood, misrepresented, the idea of divorce, the idea of the death of your parents, right? If you're like 8 or 9 years old reading this stuff, those things are really scary and they cause anxiety in you that's way beyond a pretend ghost, right? At 8 or 9, most kids know that ghosts, aren't hanging out in the graveyard in the backyard. But these ideas of, not being understood for who you are, losing your family, losing your friends, moving to a new place, those things are real fears. Being mocked for legitimate fears was part of the storyline. Being uprooted to a new home, new school, new community, conflict with your step-parents, parents choosing step-parent over you, and then also in all of that, this sister Molly had insights that the others weren't getting, right? So that's kind of freaky in itself when you're seeing something that other people don't see. Since I last read this book in 2019, when it freaked me right out, 2 major adult fears have happened in my life. The death of a parent. I lost my dad a couple of years ago. And then just general disconnect. I've always said one of my biggest fears in my family is my family being separated. An adult child going off one direction and the rest of us going another, or a couple of kids going off, or, whatever, or even, disconnection with my parents, or those sorts of things have started happening in my family, and some of it in not so good ways. And that's just part of everybody growing up, right? And going and doing their own thing. But I really honestly could not think of anything scarier than that. And those things have happened to me since 2019 in several ways. And so when I look at everything now, I'm just like, I don't know, I don't want to be bound and gagged and drug off somewhere. Like, I guess that's my biggest fear now, right? But it's those deeper emotional fears were way bigger than any sort of spooky ghost fear I ever could have experienced. So why use ghosts? I mean, are ghosts even real? Do the Victorians believe ghosts were real? Do we believe ghosts are real? I wonder if it has anything to do with this much, much older ghost story. This ghost story can actually be found in the Bible. And we know that Victorians were very interested in their Bibles and the things of religion. So this story can be found in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. And it's the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And basically there's a rich guy and there is a beggar named Lazarus. Lazarus was laid at the gate of this rich man's house, right? Like, maybe the rich guy will help him. And of course, he didn't. Well, both of them died. Lazarus went to wait in, what they called Abraham's bosom, basically just waiting for the second resurrection. And then the evil man, he ended up going down to Hades. And when he was down there, he yelled at Abraham and he said, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus so he can go and dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue," right? So here we're dealing with a couple of dead guys talking, right? Coming back alive, right? A ghost even, but it gets a little more ghosty here in a second. So "I am tormented in this flame," he says. And Abraham said to him, "Listen, when you were alive, you got all your good stuff, and Lazarus, he got all the evil stuff. And now he is comforted while you are tormented. This is the results of your choices, right? And besides all this, between us, there's a great gulf fixed so that those who want to pass from here to you cannot, nor can those from there pass to us." Now remember, we're talking about the Victorians. Why did they get this idea of ghosts? Why did they get this idea of moral tales, these warning tales? Then the evil or rich man says, "I beg you, therefore, Father, that you would send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may testify to them, lest they also come to this place of torment." So the rich man is like, send Lazarus to go warn everybody. Well, he would be a ghost, right? Send this ghost of Lazarus to go warn everyone so they don't end up in this place where I'm at. And Abraham's like, listen, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets now, they're not going to listen to a ghost. So, Abraham, who was like running Abraham's bosom, this little place where they hang out and wait, I guess, he was like, no, I won't send this ghost. And so these people never got the opportunity to be warned, right? That's kind of the gist of this story. They never got the chance to be warned about their moral failure. And I just wonder how much of that story idea sort of plays into the Victorians' ideas about these moral tales, these warning tales that they are telling. Are they trying to do what Lazarus could not do and warn you now, right? And send these ghosts to warn you to do good and do right, get your act together and take care of people so that you don't end up in Hades like this rich man who was just turning a blind eye to those in need because he was so obsessed with himself. I see a lot of parallels there. Do you guys see those parallels? Right? All of Scrooge's ghosts, they brought warnings. Elizabeth Gaskell's ghost was bringing kind of a moral warning. At the end of it, it sort of wraps up the morality of the story. The golden arm, obviously, right? That's a moral story. That woman had unfinished business with her husband. And so I wonder if that is why they told these things at Christmas time. Because Christmas time represented this time of the year when we were supposed to be thinking about goodwill toward men, right? And taking care of one another and modeling the character of Yeshua, Jesus, who came to earth to, save us from the things we couldn't save ourselves from, to offer salvation to everyone, and rich or poor, and no matter what, race or gender or social status or whatever, no matter what you've done, right, that salvation is available to everybody. I just wonder if maybe that's why they chose Christmas time to tell these stories, because everybody was or should have been thinking about the good they could do during these cold seasons, where people are short on things. They can't be growing stuff in their gardens. All that stuff just kind of wraps up together to be a perfect time of year to remind those who have much that there are people who exist who have very little and they need our help and compassion. Now, speaking of unfinished business, that is a pretty common trope as well. In the book, The Thing at the Foot of the Bed, there's a story called Milk Bottles, where a young mother comes every day to this grocery store and she gets a bottle of milk, and then they find the empty milk bottles on a grave in the graveyard in the evening. And so when the grave is opened up, because they're trying to figure out what's going on here, right, they find that there is a dead woman laying in there with her very much alive baby laying next to her, and they realized that this mother had unfinished business. She needed to alert somebody, hey, my baby's alive. You guys buried me with a baby that, just because I died, you guys buried me with my baby thinking it was dead too, but really it's not. Please come save her, right? And so then they are able to take care of the baby, and now that mother can rest in peace. Wait Till Helen Comes carries a similar message. The young girl, Helen, she actually played a part in the death of her mother and stepfather. The house was on fire and her mother was looking for her everywhere, and she was too afraid to come out. And so her mother died looking for her. Then she ran out and actually drowned in the lake, didn't die in the fire. So she roams the property, right? Carrying all this guilt, causing young girls to drown so that she won't be alone in the afterlife. Right? But all these young girls that she tries to kill, they all go on to rest in peace because they don't have any guilt. Well, it turns out that little Heather, who she's currently trying to take down into the lake with her, also was responsible for her mother's death, that she was messing around with a stove or something and ended up catching the house on fire. And so Heather is also wandering with this same level of guilt, but in the living part of life, right? And so I guess the ghostly Helen thinks that if Heather dies in the lake also, that Heather will also be roaming in this unfinished business part of life. But thankfully, at the end of the story, Helen's parents' bones are found in the old house down in the basement, and Helen is reunited with the ghost of her mother, and they are able to go off into eternity in peace because Helen is forgiven, and now she also can rest in peace. Now, a final trope that I want to make mention of, though I did not read a lot in this vein, is the family curse trope. So this too, I think, comes from biblical sources. When you read in Exodus 34, you find that Yahweh, God, talks about how he will visit the iniquity of the evil people onto the third and fourth generation. And he's basically saying, if you're going to, live an evil life, then that is going to affect your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids. And right, we see that in, day-to-day life, like what we do affects our families. That's what God is saying here. And then he goes on, though, in Deuteronomy 24 to clarify that people are not judged eternally for the sins of others. He's just showing that Exodus verse is just talking about how our sin has far-reaching consequences, potentially for generations to come, but we are all still responsible for our own, repentance and all those sorts of things. So that hasn't stopped this from becoming a popular doctrine in and out of church, though. Many people will say, well, the sins of the fathers are carried on. They're only carried on if you don't, get your act together and repent yourself. But anyway, the Hounds of the Baskervilles goes with this trope, that family curse. So Sherlock Holmes is investigating and potentially putting a stop to a possible generational curse involving this family and a demon hound. And I think the idea of a family curse is probably more prevalent than we even realize, right? How many times do we say, oh, I got that from my mom, or I act like that because my dad did this and his dad did that as well. I think we probably accept more negativity into our lives than we should when we just assume that certain things run in the family. I think when it comes down to it, the idea of ghosts and goblins can be scary, but what really drives fear in a person is their own sense of insecurity and failure. People play that what if game, right, that I was talking a little bit about, and we psychoanalyze ourselves, and we sometimes do not like what we see. The Victorians used this time of year to emphasize those behaviors which keep us stuck in apathy and in selfishness, because it contrasted so starkly with love and joy and selflessness that has been a part of this season for as long as anyone can remember. But did those stories really serve to change hearts and minds and behavior? That's a story for another day. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun doing this research project, putting together my thoughts and ideas. I hope that this was fun for you too. Let me know what you guys are reading these last couple of weeks of December, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.